Imagine you are sitting on a split pine log, your legs straddling the rough bark, your boots dangling over a V-shaped wooden trough barely 3 feet wide. Beneath you, ice-cold Sierra Nevada snowmelt is rushing at 40 miles an hour. The trough is bolted to the face of a granite cliff, 2,000 feet above a valley floor you cannot see because the morning fog has swallowed everything below your knees. The log lurches forward. You grip the sides of the trough with both hands, and the splinters bite into your palms. But you do not let go, because letting go means death. The water accelerates, 50 miles an hour. The trough curves left around a blind bend they call a devil's elbow, and the centrifugal force lifts your body off the log and pushes you toward the outside edge, toward open air and a quarter-mile drop onto granite. Shikulas, you lean hard into the turn, your shoulder scrapes the inside wall of the flume, and you survive. This time. That is what it felt like to ride a logging flume in the American West. And the men who did it, the flume herders, did not do it once for a dare. They did it every single working day. Some of them did it for years, and some of them never came home. This is the story of the wooden highways that carried billions of board feet of lumber off mountains that had no roads, no railroads, and no mercy. Massive V-shaped water channels built along sheer cliff faces, spanning valleys on wooden trestles 100 feet in the air, stretching for 50 miles through some of the most brutal terrain on the continent. They were engineering marvels designed by self-taught men, constructed by workers hanging from ropes over canyons, and operated by crews who understood that any shift could be their last. Before trucks, before mountain highways, before diesel engines could crawl up a 9% grade, there was wood and water and gravity, and the men who trusted their lives to all three. To understand why anyone would build a wooden water channel down the face of a mountain, you have to understand the problem they were trying to solve. And the problem was enormous. By the 1870s and 1880s, the lumber industry in the American West had a geography crisis. The finest stands of timber, the towering sugar pines and ponderosa pines of the Sierra Nevada, the Douglas fir of the Pacific Northwest, grew at elevations between 4,000 and 8,000 feet. Massive trees. Some of them 200 feet tall, 6 feet in diameter at the base, some containing enough board feet of lumber to frame an entire house from a single trunk. But they were up there, and the sawmills, the railroads, the cities that needed that lumber were down there, in the valleys, in the flatlands, separated by thousands of vertical feet of rock, canyon, and wilderness with no roads. You could fell a tree at 7,000 feet elevation in the Sierra Nevada and have absolutely no way to get it to the mill. Oxen teams could drag logs on skid roads, but only on gentle terrain, and the mountains of the West were anything but gentle. Splash dams could flush logs down rivers, but many of these timber stands sat miles from any navigable water, and you could not build a conventional road up a mountainside that steep. Not with the technology of the 1870s, not affordably. The timber was stranded, but billions of dollars worth of lumber locked on mountaintops as if behind a wall. The solution when it came was elegantly simple in concept and terrifyingly complex in execution. If you cannot bring the logs to the water, bring the water to the logs, build a wooden channel, a trough, and let gravity and running water do the work that no team of oxen or horses ever could. The lumber flume. A continuous V-shaped wooden chute fed by mountain streams or diverted creeks that could carry logs and sawn lumber from the highest ridgelines all the way down to the valley floor. No engines, no fuel, no animals, just water flowing downhill, carrying wood with it. The idea was not entirely new. Small-scale flumes had been used in mining operations during the California Gold Rush to transport water for hydraulic mining. But what the timber industry did with the concept in the 1870s through the 1910s was something different entirely. They built flume systems of staggering scale. 50 miles long, crossing canyons on trestle bridges 100 feet above the ground, hugging cliff faces where a single misstep during construction meant falling to your death on the rocks below. These were not little irrigation ditches, these were engineered transportation corridors and building them required a breed of worker that the modern world has never seen and will never see again. The typical logging flume was built from rough-sawn lumber, usually the same species of wood being harvested from the mountain above. The channel itself was V-shaped, constructed from 2 planks set at a 90-degree angle, creating a trough approximately 3 feet wide at the top and about 2 feet deep. The V-shape was the critical innovation. A flat-bottom channel would have required far more water to float lumber, and the water would spread out, losing velocity. But a V-shape concentrates the flow. At the narrow bottom of the V, even a modest stream of water moves fast, and a log sitting in that V-shape rides the current like a sled on ice. The geometry was the engine. The flume was supported by a framework of wooden trestles and brackets. On flat ground, the flume sat on simple post supports a few feet off the earth, but flat ground was rare. Most of the flume's length clung to mountainsides, and the support structures had to be built out from cliff faces, sometimes cantilevered 20 or 30 feet over open air to maintain the necessary grade. The ideal gradient was about a 3 to 5% downhill slope, roughly 150 to 250 feet of drop per mile. Too shallow and the water would not carry the logs. Too steep and the logs would outrun the water, pile up at curves, and destroy the flume. Maintaining that precise gradient over 50 miles of mountain terrain was a surveying and engineering achievement that deserves far more recognition than history has given it. These flume builders, men like James W. Haynes, who engineered the Fresno Flume and irrigation company's 42-mile system in the 1890s, were solving calculus problems in the field on horseback, with hand levels and chain measurements. They had to account for every ridge, every ravine, every change in rock composition, and every seasonal creek crossing over the entire length of the system. A miscalculation of a single degree of grade over 10 miles would render the flume useless. But the surveying was the easy part. The construction was where men died. Picture a construction crew in 1889, somewhere along the Fresno Flume route in the Sierra Nevada, above Clovis, California. They have reached a section of the route where the mountain face is nearly vertical, a granite wall dropping straight down for 300 feet into a canyon choked with boulders and dead timber. The flume must cross this face. There is no way around it. The surveyors have already determined that rerouting would add 6 miles and $12,000 to the project. So the flume goes across the cliff. The construction method was this. Workers were lowered from the top of the cliff on ropes, hemp ropes, not the synthetic climbing ropes of the modern era, but hand-braided hemp lines that frayed, that stretched when wet, that could snap without warning under a dynamic load. These men were not rock climbers. They were loggers and carpenters. Most of them had never been on a rope in their lives before this job, but the job needed doing, so they went over the edge. Hanging on those ropes, swinging in the wind above a 300-foot drop, they drilled holes into the granite by hand, steel drill bits driven by sledgehammers while hanging in a rope harness. Try to imagine the physical mechanics of that. You need one hand on the drill, one hand on the hammer, and somehow you need to anchor yourself against the rock face so the force of your hammer swing does not spin you away from the wall. Your rope is your only connection to life, and the man above you, the man belaying you, is another logger who learned rope handling last Tuesday. Into those hand-drilled holes, they drove iron brackets. Onto those brackets, they bolted wooden beams. Onto those beams, they built the flume trough itself, section by section, plank by plank, while hundreds of feet of empty air yawned beneath their boots. The sections had to be joined with absolute precision, because a leak at a joint would erode the support structure, and an unsupported section of flume loaded with water and timber would tear itself off the mountain. Every joint was hand-fitted, every bolt was hand-turned, and every single piece of lumber used to build the flume had to be carried to the construction site by hand or by mule, along trails that barely qualified as goat paths. The Fresno Flume project employed hundreds of men over several years. The system cost roughly $2,000 to $5,000 per mile to build, And when you adjust those 1890s dollars for inflation, you begin to understand the scale of investment. For a 42-mile system, the total construction cost was the equivalent of tens of millions in today's money. But the timber it would carry was worth far more, so the investors signed the checks, and the workers went back over the cliff edges. Construction crews lived in temporary camps along the Flume Road, tent camps at altitude, often above 6,000 feet, where winter arrived early and stayed late. The food was basic: beans, salt pork, bread, coffee strong enough to strip varnish. The hours were brutal, dawn to dark, 6 days a week, with Sunday off unless the foreman decided the project was behind schedule, which it usually was. The pay was modest, perhaps $2 to $3 a day for the most dangerous work, which was cliff face construction. General laborers earned less. A man could work an entire summer on a flume project and come home with barely enough money to carry his family through winter. And the injuries were constant. Crushed fingers from misplaced hammer blows on a swinging rope platform where you could not brace properly. Rope burns that stripped the skin off palms, leaving raw tissue exposed to sawdust and mountain grime that guaranteed infection. Like shoulders wrenched from holding body weight against a cliff face for hours at a time. Falls that did not kill, but shattered ankles and wrists, ending a man's ability to do this kind of work permanently, with no compensation and no recourse. There was no workers' compensation law. There was no insurance policy. If you were injured, you were simply done. Carried back to camp, patched up by whoever in the crew had the steadiest hands, and left to figure out your own way down the mountain. And then there were the falls that did kill, men who slipped on wet granite, men whose ropes failed at the splice point, men who lost their grip when the afternoon sun heated the rock and sweat made everything slick, and they fell silently into the canyon below. Sometimes the crew heard the impact, sometimes they did not. The body recovery, so if it happened at all, was a grim task assigned to the newest members of the crew. Their names, most of them, are lost. The company ledgers recorded them as labor costs, not as human beings. A notation in a foreman's daily log: 1 man lost. That was the obituary the industry provided. When a section of flume was completed, it was tested by releasing water from the supply source, a diverted creek or a small dam built at the top of the system. The first run of water through a new section was a tense moment. Every joint was watched for leaks. Every trestle was checked for deflection under load. If the water ran clean and the structure held, the section was approved and the crew moved on to the next stretch of cliff. If a leak appeared, or worse, if a trestle buckled, the repair work began immediately, and often under conditions even more dangerous than the original construction because now the damaged section was partially waterlogged and unstable. Once the complete flume system was operational, the real spectacle began. At the top of the flume, at a loading point near the timber harvest area, freshly sawn lumber and sometimes whole logs were fed into the water-filled trough. The current grabbed them immediately. A 12-foot plank of sugar pine hitting the water at the top of the Fresno Flume would travel 42 miles to the terminus at the Clovis Lumberyard in approximately 3 hours. 42 miles in 3 hours. No engines, no fuel. Just gravity and mountain water. The speed varied with the grade. On gentler sections, the lumber drifted at perhaps 10 or 15 miles per hour. On steeper pitches, it accelerated to 30. 40, even 60 miles per hour. At those speeds, the lumber was not gently floating. It was hurtling. A 12-foot plank moving at 50 miles per hour through a 3-foot wide wooden trough is a projectile. And if something went wrong, if a log turned sideways, if 2 pieces of lumber caught on each other and formed a jam, the entire system could back up in seconds and the resulting pressure could blow out a section of flume. Which brings us to the flume herders, the most dangerous regular job in the American logging industry. And that is saying something, because the logging industry was the most dangerous industry in America. Flume herders were stationed at intervals along the flume's length, particularly at curves, junctions, and sections where jams were most likely to occur. Their job was simple to describe and nightmarish to perform: keep the lumber moving. That was it. Keep the lumber moving. When a jam started to form, and they formed constantly, the herder had to reach the blockage, identify the offending piece of lumber, the key log that was causing everything behind it to stack up, and dislodge it before the backed-up water and timber built enough pressure to blow out a section of flume. This often meant reaching into a trough full of rushing ice-cold water with bare hands and wrestling a waterlogged log that weighed 200 or 300 pounds, trying to rotate it or push it free, while standing on a maintenance catwalk no wider than your shoulders, bolted to the side of a cliff face. One wrong move and the jam would release all at once, and the surge of water and timber would sweep your arms, your tools, and potentially your entire body down the flume. The herders worked alone. Each man was responsible for his section, typically a mile or two of flume, and there was no one nearby to help if something went wrong. If a herder was injured by a shifting log, if a jam release caught his hand and broke his fingers, he dealt with it himself. He wrapped the injury, he kept working, or he walked out. There was no radio, there was no telephone line along most of these routes. You were alone on a mountainside with a wooden trough full of speeding water and timber, and your survival depended entirely on your own judgment and skill. But the herder's most famous and most terrifying duty was riding the flume itself. When a jam formed at a location between herder stations, someone had to get there fast. The fastest way to travel along a flume was to ride it. Herders used what were called flume boats, small V-shaped wooden craft, barely large enough for one man, designed to fit inside the flume trough. The herder would set his flume boat in the water, climb in, and let the current take him. No brakes, no steering beyond leaning your body weight, no way to stop except reaching a section where the grade flattened enough to slow down, or dragging your hands along the sides of the trough to create friction, which shredded your gloves and then shredded your skin. Riding a flume boat at 40 or 50 miles per hour through a 3-foot wide wooden channel was by every objective measure insane. The water sprayed constantly into your face, into your eyes, into your mouth when you made the mistake of opening it to breathe. And the boat vibrated and bounced over every joint in the flume planking, and the joints came every 12 feet, which meant at 50 miles an hour, you were hitting a bump roughly every 1/6 of a second. The noise was tremendous. The roar of the water, the scraping of the boat hull against the trough walls, the creak and groan of the trestle structures as the dynamic load passed over them. You could not hear a man shouting from 10 feet away. Around blind curves, the centrifugal force tried to throw you out of the trough entirely. Your body wanted to go straight. The flume turned. The water piled against the outside wall. The boat tilted, and you leaned in the opposite direction as hard as you could, praying that physics would favor you. Sometimes visitors were taken on flume rides as a kind of tourist attraction, a novelty thrill for journalists, railroad executives, or the occasional brave politician touring the timber operations. The accounts they left behind are remarkable for their raw terror. Grown men who had survived the Civil War, who had crossed the Great Plains, described the flume ride as the most frightening experience of their lives. One visitor wrote that the sensation of rounding a curve on a trestle bridge 100 feet above a canyon was like nothing human beings were designed to experience. He could see the valley floor between the planks of the flume trough and feel the entire structure flexing under the force of the water. He swore he would never do it again. The herders who rode the same route every day said nothing. They just chewed their tobacco and waited for the next jam. If the flume crossed a valley on a trestle bridge, you were suddenly 100 feet in the air, in an open wooden trough, moving at highway speed, with nothing between you and the ground except momentum and the craftsmanship of men who had been paid $2 a day to build it. The devil's elbows were the worst. That was the name loggers gave to the sharpest curves in a flume system, the points where the trough bent hard around a rock outcropping, or followed a ridge contour at a severe angle. At these turns, the water piled up against the outside wall of the flume, logs and lumber stacked against the outside edge, and a rider in a flume boat would be thrown toward the outside wall with tremendous force. If the wall held, you survived. If the wall had been weakened by rot, by ice damage, by the constant battering of lumber, the wall could give way, and you went over the edge. Men died at devil's elbows. How many exactly, no one knows. The record-keeping was not designed to honor the dead. It was designed to track board feet delivered. There is a particular cruelty in the way the logging industry treated its flume workers. These were men doing work that required extraordinary courage, split-second judgment, and physical endurance that would challenge any modern athlete. And they were paid the same as a man stacking lumber in a yard. The danger premium was essentially zero. The logic was simple and cold. If this man dies, another man needs a job. The supply of desperate workers in the 1890s American West was inexhaustible. Immigrant laborers, displaced miners, men running from debts or warrants or failed farms. They would take the job, they would ride the flume, and when they died, another man would take their place before the body was recovered. The Fresno Flume and Irrigation Company system, engineered by James W. Haynes and completed in the 1890s, was one of the most ambitious flume projects ever built. 42 miles of continuous V-shaped wooden channel, descending from the timber stands of the Sierra Nevada above what is now the Shaver Lake area, all the way down to the lumber processing facilities near Clovis and Fresno, California. The system followed the contours of the San Joaquin River drainage, crossing dozens of side canyons on trestle bridges, hugging cliff faces along the river gorge, and passing through terrain that even today is considered remote and difficult to access. Haynes solved problems along the Fresno Flume route that had no precedent. At one point, the flume had to cross a canyon that was too wide for a conventional trestle bridge. His solution was to build the longest wooden flume trestle of its era, a lattice of hand-cut timbers rising from the canyon floor, each joint pinned and braced against wind loading and the dynamic forces of water and moving timber. The trestle swayed in high wind. Workers who crossed it on the maintenance catwalk reported feeling seasick from the motion. But it held. For decades, it held. The Fresno system could move an astonishing volume of lumber. On a peak production day, hundreds of thousands of board feet of sawn lumber passed through the flume, arriving at the Clovis terminus, stacked, sorted, and ready for rail shipment to the construction booms of Los Angeles and San Francisco. The system transformed the economics of Sierra Nevada timber, or trees that had been worthless because they could not be transported, were suddenly the most valuable timber in the state. Fortunes were made, not by the men who built the flume or rode it, of course, by the men who owned the company. But the Fresno Flume was not the only system, and in some ways it was not even the most impressive. Flume systems were built throughout the Sierra Nevada, in the mountains of Idaho and Montana, in the forests of Washington and Oregon. The Pacific Northwest systems faced a different set of challenges. The rainfall was heavier, which meant more water supply, but also more erosion and rot. The timber was different. Douglas fir logs were heavier than Sierra Nevada pine, which meant the flumes needed stronger construction and steeper grades to maintain flow. And the terrain, while not as vertically dramatic as the Sierra Nevada granite faces, was covered in dense, almost impenetrable forest. Construction crews had to fell the trees immediately in front of them just to see where they were building. Progress on some Pacific Northwest flume projects was measured in feet per day, not miles. In Washington's Cascade Range, flumes ran through snowpack that persisted well into July, and the water that fed them was glacial melt barely above freezing. Herders on those systems wore wool from head to toe, layer upon layer, and still suffered frostbite on their hands and faces during early morning shifts, when the temperature at altitude dropped below freezing, and the spray from the flume coated everything in a thin layer of ice. The maintenance catwalks became skating rinks. The flume walls became glazed and slick. Working in those conditions required a particular kind of stubbornness that bordered on defiance of common sense. In the mountains above Lake Tahoe, a network of flumes fed the insatiable appetite of the Comstock Lode silver mines in Virginia City, Nevada. Those mines needed lumber, enormous quantities of lumber, tunnel supports, building frames, mine shaft cribbing, fuel for the stamp mills that crushed ore. The forests of the Sierra Nevada eastern slope were stripped to feed the mines, and the flumes carried the timber down at a pace that astonished even the miners who had ordered it. It was said that a tree standing on the ridge above Lake Tahoe in the morning could be a mine timber shoring up a tunnel wall in Virginia City by nightfall. The Tahoe Flume systems were shorter than the Fresno system, typically running 10 to 20 miles. But they were steeper and faster, with grades that pushed water velocities to the upper limit of what the wooden trough could withstand. The lumber that came off those flumes arrived at the terminus battered, water-stripped of bark, and occasionally split from the violence of the journey. But it arrived. And that was all the mine operators cared about. The efficiency was breathtaking. The environmental cost was catastrophic. Entire mountainsides were denuded. Erosion scoured the slopes. Streams that had once run clear turned brown with silt. The scars are still visible today, more than a century later, if you know where to look. The environmental destruction wrought by the Flume era is part of this story, and ignoring it would be dishonest. The Flumes themselves were remarkable engineering, but their purpose was extraction. Total, unrelentless extraction. The logging companies did not replant. They did not manage the forest. They cut everything that could be sold, flumed it down the mountain, and moved on. When the timber was gone, the flume was abandoned. The wooden trestles rotted. The trough collapsed. The iron brackets rusted on the cliff faces, and the mountain, stripped of its forest, endured decades of erosion, landslides, and ecological damage that altered watersheds for generations. But within that destruction, there is something else, something worth examining. The physical courage and ingenuity of the men who built and operated these systems commands a kind of respect that transcends the economic brutality of the industry they served. A man who hangs from a rope on a cliff face to drill holes in granite is not thinking about shareholder value. He is thinking about the next bolt hole, about the quality of his rope, about whether the man above him is paying attention, and a man who rides a flume boat through a devil's elbow at 50 miles an hour is not thinking about board feet per mile. He is thinking about the physics of the curve, the feel of the water, the lean of his body. These men were, in the purest sense, craftsmen of survival, and they practiced their craft in conditions that would be considered criminally dangerous by any modern standard. The Flume era began to fade in the early 1900s, and by the 1920s, it was effectively over. The technology that killed the Flume was the same technology that was transforming every other industry in America: the internal combustion engine and the railroad. Logging railroads had been operating alongside flumes since the 1880s. But in the early years, the railroads could not reach the extreme elevations where the best timber grew. Their locomotives lacked the power to climb steep grades, and building rail lines through mountain terrain was prohibitively expensive. But locomotive technology improved rapidly. Geared locomotives, designs like the Shay and the Climax, could creep up grades that would stall a conventional engine. Switchback routes could conquer mountains that seemed impossible. By 1910, logging railroads were reaching elevations and terrain that had once been flume-only territory, and the railroad had decisive advantages. It could carry far more tonnage than any flume. A single train could move in one trip what a flume would take days to carry. And critically, railroads could operate in both directions. A flume only goes downhill. You cannot send supplies, equipment, or men up a flume. A railroad can haul timber down and carry crews, food, tools, and replacement parts back up. The logistics advantage was overwhelming. The economics shifted. Where flume systems required constant maintenance, endless repair of rot and ice damage, and trestle deterioration, a well-built railroad bed was more durable and less labor-intensive to maintain. The flume herder, the most skilled and dangerous position in the system, had no equivalent in railroad logging. You did not need a man to ride the train and clear jams with his bare hands. And then came trucks. As road-building technology improved through the 1910s and 1920s, and as trucks became more powerful and more reliable, the logging industry gained the ability to build temporary roads directly to the harvest site. Load logs onto flatbed trucks and drive them down to the mill. No water needed, no fixed infrastructure stretching 50 miles through the wilderness, no seasonal shutdowns when the water supply froze or dried up. When the timber in one area was gone, you simply abandoned the road and built another one to the next stand. The truck was the final nail in the flume's coffin. It was cheaper, more flexible, and it did not require an act of extraordinary courage just to operate. The last major logging flumes ceased regular operation in the 1930s. Some survived as water conveyances for irrigation, a secondary purpose that many flumes had served from the beginning. The Fresno Flume system, in fact, was always a dual-purpose system. The "and irrigation" in the Fresno Flume and irrigation company name was not an afterthought. The same water that carried lumber also irrigated the farmland of the San Joaquin Valley. When the timber ran out, the irrigation function continued, and parts of the old flume route were eventually incorporated into modern water delivery systems. But the flumes themselves, the wooden V-shaped channels clinging to mountain faces, are gone. Rotted, collapsed, scavenged for lumber, reclaimed by the forest they once helped destroy. In a few places, you can still find remnants, iron brackets bolted to cliff faces in the Sierra Nevada backcountry, visible from hiking trails if you know what you're looking at. Concrete footings, where trestles once stood, now surrounded by second-growth timber. The occasional plank, gray and splintered, half buried in a stream bed. Artifacts of an era when American industry solved its problems with wood, water, courage, and an almost complete indifference to the lives of the men who did the work. There's a tendency when we tell stories about the industrial past to sanitize them, to focus on the engineering genius and the economic growth and the march of progress, to frame the workers as heroic, which they were, without acknowledging that their heroism was demanded by an economic system that treated them as expendable. The men who built the logging flumes were heroes. They were also victims. Both things are true at the same time, and pretending otherwise dishonors them more than forgetting their names. Think about what it took. Really think about it, because it is easy to hear these stories as abstractions, as history, as something that happened to other people in another time. But these were real men, with real bodies that bled and broke and fell. A man wakes up before dawn in a canvas tent at 6,000 feet. The frost has crept under the tent flap overnight, and his blanket is stiff with it. He pulls on wool trousers and a flannel shirt that has not been washed in 2 weeks because there is no facility for washing anything in this camp. He eats a bowl of beans and drinks bitter coffee that has been boiling on the fire since the night cook put it on at 4 in the morning. He walks to a cliff edge where his foreman hands him a rope and tells him today he is working the overhang section, the stretch where the cliff face angles outward over the canyon, which means he will be hanging in free space for most of the day with no rock to brace his feet against. He ties that rope around his waist, because a proper climbing harness will not be invented for another 70 years, and he lowers himself over the edge of a vertical granite face. For 10 hours, he drills holes and drives brackets into stone while suspended above a canyon that would kill him in 4 seconds of free fall. His arms shake from fatigue by mid-morning. His hands crack and bleed from the cold and the constant abrasion of hemp rope and rough-cut iron. The granite dust fills his lungs with every breath, and he coughs constantly, a dry, hacking cough that half the crew shares and that none of them will ever fully recover from. He hauls himself back up at dusk with bleeding hands and a back that aches from his hips to his skull. He eats more beans. He sleeps on the frozen ground. He does it again tomorrow, for $2 a day. And because he did that, lumber reached the valley, houses were built, cities grew, California became what California became. The connection between that man on the rope and the house you might be sitting in right now is direct and unbroken. The lumber industry built the American West, and the flumes were the arteries that carried the lifeblood of that industry from mountaintop to market. Without the flumes, the timber stays on the mountain. Without the timber, there are no homes, no railroad ties, no mine supports, no telegraph poles. The entire infrastructure of Western expansion slows by decades. The men who built the flumes understood this, at least in an abstract way. They knew they were doing important work, but importance did not make the work less terrifying, and it did not make the pay less insulting, and it did not bring back the men who fell. The logging flume era lasted roughly 50 years, from the 1870s through the 1920s. In that half-century, these wooden highways moved more timber than any other transportation method in the mountainous West. They made millionaires out of lumber barons and corpses out of laborers, and when they were no longer needed, they were abandoned without ceremony. Today, if you hike in the Sierra Nevada backcountry, you might cross a ridge where the forest is thinner than it should be, where the trees are all the same age, all second growth, all about 100 years old. That uniformity is the fingerprint of a clear cut. Somewhere nearby, if you look carefully along the cliff faces and canyon walls, you might find an iron bracket bolted to a granite face, rusted nearly through but still holding after more than a century of mountain weather. Or that bracket held a flume trough, and that trough carried lumber, and that lumber built something down in the valley that still stands. You might find the remnants of a trestle foundation, concrete footings poured by hand in the 1890s, now cracked and mossy, but still anchored to bedrock. The wooden trestle they supported is long gone, rotted and collapsed decades ago, but the footings remain like headstones marking where something extraordinary once stood. In creek beds, you might find flume planks, gray and splintered and half buried in gravel, the nail holes still visible in the wood, the grain still tight from old-growth timber that no longer exists in these mountains. The men who drove that bracket into the rock, who rode the flume through Devil's Elbows, who cleared jams with their bare hands in freezing water at 50 miles an hour, those men deserve more than a rusted bracket for a monument. They deserve to be remembered as what they were, not as romantic figures from a simpler time, because their time was not simple, and there was nothing romantic about hanging from a hemp rope over a 300-foot drop. They deserve to be remembered as workers, skilled, courageous, exploited workers who built impossible things in impossible places because the job needed doing. And they were the ones who showed up to do it. The wooden highways are gone, the mountains remain, and the debt we owe to the men who connected one to the other has never been paid. If you made it to the end, you are not a casual viewer. You are someone who cares about the real stories behind how this country was built. Subscribe, because next week, I am taking you inside another chapter of American industry that history has tried to forget. That video is on screen right now. I will see you there.